Somewhere in the paperwork of nearly every long-established American family, there is a small, stubborn myth waiting to be tested. The story, passed down at some kitchen table generations ago, that we go back to the Mayflower. It is one of the most common pieces of family lore in the United States, repeated so often and so casually that it has practically become a genre of its own. And it is also one of the few pieces of family lore that can actually be checked against a hard, fixed, historically documented list. The Mayflower did not carry thousands of people. It carried exactly 102 passengers across the Atlantic in the autumn of 1620, plus a working crew of roughly 30 sailors who returned to England the following spring and left no descendants in the colony. That is a small, closed, permanently fixed set of names, which means that whether or not a particular surname belongs to that story is not really a matter of speculation. It is a matter of record. The record itself comes from an unusually good source, as far as 17th century documentation goes. William Bradford, who sailed on the Mayflower and went on to serve for decades as governor of Plymouth Colony, kept a detailed contemporaneous account of the voyage and the settlement that followed, later published under the title of Plymouth Plantation. Bradford's manuscript is the single most important surviving source for who was actually on that ship. And it is the foundation on which essentially every modern verified Mayflower passenger list is still built. Genealogical organizations, most prominently the General Society of Mayflower Descendants and its state-level affiliates, have spent more than a century cross-referencing Bradford's account against English parish records, Dutch Leiden church records, Plymouth Colony land and probate records, and later compiled genealogies to build out exhaustive, documented family lines running from each of the 1620 passengers down through subsequent generations. This is not folklore. It is one of the most thoroughly researched genealogical datasets in American history, precisely because so many people have spent so long trying to verify or disprove their own family's version of the story. So what were the actual last names on that ship, and how many Americans today are plausibly connected to them? The list is smaller than most people assume, and the story behind several of these names is stranger, harder, and more interesting than the sanitized Thanksgiving version most people were taught in elementary school. Roughly 40 of the Mayflower's passengers were members of a Puritan separatist congregation who had been living in religious exile in Leiden, in the Netherlands, for over a decade before deciding to relocate again, this time across the Atlantic in search of a place where they could practice their faith without interference from the Church of England. The rest of the passengers were not religious separatists at all. They were what the separatists themselves, somewhat uncharitably, referred to as strangers, families and individuals recruited by the London merchants financing the voyage, along with indentured servants and apprentices bound to wealthier passengers, all traveling for reasons that ranged from religious conviction to simple economic opportunity to outright desperation. This mixture matters because it means the modern mythology of the Mayflower as a uniformly pious religious expedition does not match the ship's actual passenger manifest. It was, in reality, a fairly ordinary and genuinely mixed group of English men, women, and children, some deeply devout and some along for entirely secular reasons, crammed together for more than 2 months in a ship roughly the length of a modern basketball court. At the top of almost every list of Mayflower surnames with substantial numbers of documented living descendants is Alden. John Alden, a young cooper hired in Southampton to help maintain the ship's barrels, was not part of the original separatist congregation at all. He was recruited, essentially as ship's crew, but he chose to stay in Plymouth rather than return to England, married fellow passenger Priscilla Mullins, and became one of the most prolifically documented ancestral lines in all of Mayflower genealogy. The Alden-Mullins courtship later became the basis of a known 19th century poem that romanticized the pairing considerably beyond what the historical record actually supports. But the marriage itself, and the enormous number of documented descendants that followed from it, are genuine historical fact rather than literary invention. Bradford itself is a surname with a documented line, descending from Governor William Bradford, whose wife Dorothy drowned in Cape Cod Harbor shortly after the ship's arrival, under circumstances that remain genuinely disputed among historians. Accident and possible suicide have both been proposed, and the surviving record simply does not settle the question either way. Bradford remarried in the colony and left descendants who carried the name forward through many subsequent generations of Massachusetts and broader New England history. Brewster is another major line, descending from William Brewster, the senior religious elder of the separatist congregation and one of the most influential figures in the colony's early religious life, whose family and printing background in Leiden made him one of the more educated and prominent passengers aboard the ship. Standish belongs to Miles Standish, the colony's military captain, hired for his professional soldiering experience rather than his religious convictions. He was not part of the separatist congregation and tasked with organizing Plymouth's defense against the very real threat of conflict during the colony's precarious early years. The surname has remained attached to numerous towns, streets, and institutions across Massachusetts in the centuries since. Winslow descends from Edward Winslow, who became one of Plymouth Colony's most important early diplomats, negotiating directly with Wampanoag leader Massasoit in the agreements that allowed the fragile colony to survive its earliest and most dangerous years, and who later served multiple terms as governor. Howland is another heavily documented line, descending from John Howland, a servant of Governor Carver's household who, according to Bradford's own account, was swept overboard during a storm during the crossing and managed to grab a trailing rope and be hauled back aboard, making him, by a fairly narrow margin, the ancestor of an enormous number of living Americans, who very nearly did not have an ancestor to trace at all. Howland's documented descendants are so numerous that genealogists sometimes half joke that he is the single most reliable path by which an American family can plausibly connect to the Mayflower, given how many lines run through him. Fuller traces to Samuel Fuller, the colony's physician, whose medical knowledge, limited as it was by 17th century standards, made him one of the more practically valuable members of the settlement during a period when roughly half the original passengers died within the first winter from a combination of disease, malnutrition, and exposure. Warren descends from Richard Warren, a merchant whose family joined him in the colony after his own crossing, and whose descendants spread widely enough across New England in later generations that the surname shows up frequently in documented Mayflower genealogies even today. Chilton belongs to James Chilton, who died during the Mayflower's time anchored at Cape Cod before the colony itself was fully established, one of several passengers who did not survive to see the settlement they had sailed to help build. His daughter Mary Chilton survived him and became one of the orphaned children of the voyage, later marrying and leaving her own documented descendants. Cook traces to Francis Cook, whose son John Cook also survived the crossing and lived to a notably old age, becoming, according to some later colonial records, one of the last surviving Mayflower passengers still living in Plymouth Colony by the final decade of the 17th century. Additional documented surnames with substantial living descendant populations include Eaton, descending from Francis Eaton, whose young son later survived him and carried the family line forward, Doty, from Edward Doty, who arrived as a servant and was involved in one of the colony's earliest recorded disputes, a duel with fellow servant Edward Leicester that both men survived, Rogers, from Thomas Rogers, whose son Joseph survived the first brutal winter that killed his father, Soule, from George Soule, a servant to Edward Winslow, whose descendant lines are extensive enough to rival Howland's in sheer documented volume, Sampson, sometimes recorded as Samson, from Henry Sampson, who traveled as a child, White, from William White, whose son Peregrine White holds the distinct historical honor of being the first English child born to the Pilgrims in the New World, born aboard the Mayflower itself while it was anchored in Cape Cod Harbor before landing. Allerton, from Isaac Allerton, one of the colony's earliest merchants and negotiators. Carver, from John Carver, the colony's first governor, who died during its brutal first year. And Priest, from DeGory Priest, whose own direct male line did not survive, but whose daughters married into other documented colonial families, carrying his genetic and genealogical legacy forward under different surnames entirely. A pattern that shows up constantly in Mayflower genealogy, and that trips up a lot of amateur family historians who assume a lost surname means a lost lineage. That last point is worth dwelling on because it is one of the most persistently misunderstood aspects of Mayflower genealogy for people casually researching their own family trees. The surname disappearing from the historical record does not mean the lineage disappeared. Daughters married, took their husbands' names, and their children carried forward an entirely different surname while remaining just as legitimately descended from the original Mayflower passenger as any line that kept the name intact. This is why professional Mayflower genealogists, and the Mayflower Society itself, are far more interested in documented parent-to-child lineage across every single generation than in whether a person's current last name happens to match one from the original 1620 list. Someone with the surname Delano, for example, descends from Philippe de Lannoy, a young French Huguenot who arrived in Plymouth Colony a few years after the Mayflower itself and married into the existing colonial population. Not a Mayflower passenger by strict definition, but closely enough intertwined with the Mayflower families through subsequent marriage that Delano regularly appears in broader discussions of Mayflower descendant surnames, illustrating just how quickly and thoroughly these founding colonial families intermarried within a single generation of arrival. The same pattern of expansion through marriage explains why surnames like Southworth, Seabury, Standish, Simmons, Bass, Freeman, Bowman, Hinckley, Higgins, Mayo, Stetson, Gould, Coffin, Turner, Sylvester, Coit, Barrel, Stockbridge, Loud, Paddock, Wheeler, Babcock, Staples, Cheeseborough, Bumpass, Grinnell, Peckham, Bridgham, Drew, Thayer, Safford, and Wetherell all show up on Genealogical Society lists of documented surnames descending from Mayflower passengers within the first 3 generations after landing. Even though none of these families arrived on the ship itself, They married in. This is genuinely how colonial New England family networks worked in practice. A comparatively small founding population, isolated together on the edge of an unfamiliar continent, intermarrying repeatedly across a handful of interconnected families over just a few generations, until an enormous share of the eventual population descended from the same small cluster of founding surnames through some combination of direct and marital lines. This intermarriage pattern is also the single biggest reason Mayflower ancestry claims are so common among Americans today, and why genealogists generally treat the claim with more patience than skepticism, even when a specific family's version of the story turns out to be wrong in its details. Plymouth Colony's population, small as it started, grew steadily over the following 2 centuries, and its descendants fanned out across New England and then, as the country expanded westward, across essentially the entire continental United States. Multiply that colonial-era intermarriage pattern across roughly 400 years and a dozen or more generations, and it becomes genuinely plausible, not certain, but genuinely plausible, for millions of Americans with entirely unremarkable-sounding last names today to carry at least one documented line back to a Mayflower passenger, usually through a female ancestor whose maiden name changed at marriage and was simply forgotten by the time the story reached her great-great-grandchildren. The circumstances of the crossing itself are worth understanding in more detail than the sanitized schoolroom version usually provides, because they explain a great deal about why the passenger list looks the way it does and why so many of the names on it belong to people who did not survive their first year in the colony. The Mayflower was originally supposed to cross the Atlantic alongside a second, smaller ship called the Speedwell, but the Speedwell proved unseaworthy after repeated attempts to patch persistent leaks, and the expedition was forced to consolidate onto the Mayflower alone after multiple delayed departures from English ports, cutting significantly into the sailing season and pushing the eventual Atlantic crossing dangerously late into the year. The ship that finally departed Plymouth, England, in September of 1620 carried far more passengers than it had originally been provisioned or designed for, packed into a cargo space never intended for months of continuous human habitation, and the crossing itself took a grueling 66 days across increasingly rough autumn seas before land was finally sighted off Cape Cod in November. The passengers had originally intended to land much further south, near the mouth of the Hudson River within the territory covered by their existing charter from the Virginia Company, but storms, treacherous shoals, and the sheer exhaustion of the crossing forced Captain Christopher Jones to turn back north and anchor instead in the relative safety of Cape Cod Harbor, well outside the boundaries of the land grant the passengers actually held legal permission to settle. This unplanned landing location created an immediate legal problem, since the passengers were now going to build a colony on land where their existing charter provided no formal governing authority, and it was this specific problem that produced the document now remembered as the Mayflower Compact, signed aboard the ship on November 11th, 1620, before anyone had even gone ashore to select a permanent settlement site. 41 adult male passengers signed the compact, agreeing to form a civil body politic and to submit to whatever just and equal laws the group would subsequently agree upon, a remarkably pragmatic piece of improvised self-governance, drafted not out of lofty philosophical ambition, but out of the immediate practical necessity of preventing the strangers among the passengers, who owed no particular loyalty to the separatist congregation's leadership, from simply going their own way once ashore. The list of compact signers overlaps heavily with the surnames already discussed: Carver, Bradford, Winslow, Brewster, Allerton, Standish, Alden, Fuller, Warren, Howland, Hopkins, and dozens more, and remains one of the most frequently reproduced founding documents in American history, studied far more often for its symbolic significance as an early experiment in self-government than for the fairly mundane and specific practical crisis that actually produced it. Even after the compact was signed and a landing site was finally chosen at what became Plymouth, the passengers' ordeal was nowhere near finished. The first winter of 1620 into 1621 killed roughly half of the 102 people who had made the crossing, mortality rate driven by a brutal combination of scurvy, pneumonia, general malnutrition after months of shipboard rationing, and the simple physical exhaustion of trying to build shelter in a New England winter with wholly inadequate preparation and no established local food supply to draw on. Entire families were wiped out within a matter of weeks of each other. The Tinker family, the Turner family, and the Tilley family in particular were essentially erased in full during that first winter, leaving no surviving direct line at all from any of those specific households, a sobering counterpoint to the more famous surviving lines like Alden and Howland, and a reminder that the modern list of Mayflower surnames with documented descendants is really a survivors list twice over. First, among those who made it through the crossing at all, and then again among those who made it through that first catastrophic winter once ashore. The passengers who did survive that first winter, and the wider Wampanoag Nation, whose territory the colony had settled within, ultimately reached the tenuous mutual agreements, most famously the negotiations, conducted through Edward Winslow with the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, that allowed the colony to stabilize and eventually grow, a relationship far more complicated, fragile, and consequential for native communities in the region than the simplified Harvest Festival version of the story typically acknowledges. It is worth remembering, when tracing any family's documented line back to a specific Mayflower passenger, that the eventual survival and expansion of Plymouth colony depended enormously on agricultural knowledge, diplomatic relationships, and direct assistance from Wampanoag people, whose own communities bore the overwhelming cost of European colonization in the decades that followed, a history that sits directly underneath every colonial-era New England surname discussed here, whether or not it appears explicitly on any particular family certificate of Mayflower descent. Oh, and it is worth being precise about what DNA evidence can and cannot actually establish here, because there is a meaningful amount of public confusion on this point. Consumer autosomal DNA testing, the kind offered by major genealogy and ancestry companies, is genuinely useful for connecting living people to each other, identifying cousins, confirming or ruling out specific close and moderately close family relationships, and building out a shared match network that can help direct paper record research toward the right family lines. What autosomal DNA testing generally cannot do, at least not on its own, is prove descent from a single specific named individual who lived 400 years ago. The amount of DNA any person inherits from an ancestor, roughly 10 to 14 generations back, is vanishingly small, and by that point, in a family tree, the genetic contribution from any one specific ancestor becomes statistically negligible, and often falls below what current testing technology can reliably detect or attribute to a single source. This is a well-understood limitation in population genetics, not a controversial one. DNA thins out rapidly with each generation, and after roughly 6 to 8 generations, most people carry effectively no detectable DNA at all from any one specific named ancestor that far back, even if the documented paper trail lineage connecting them is completely accurate. Because of this genetic reality, the Mayflower Society and equivalent state-level genealogical organizations do not accept DNA test results as proof of Mayflower descent, and they never have. Formal membership requires an unbroken, fully documented paper trail, birth, marriage, and death records, or acceptable substitutes like church and probate records where civil registration did not yet exist, connecting an applicant generation by generation, without gaps, all the way back to a specific named Mayflower passenger. This is exacting, often expensive, and sometimes takes professional genealogists years to fully document for a single applicant, precisely because colonial era and early American record keeping was inconsistent. Records were lost to fires and floods and simple neglect, and maiden names in particular were often recorded inconsistently or not at all. What DNA testing is genuinely useful for, in this specific context, is a supporting role. Identifying living relatives who may have already done some of this documentary work, confirming that a suspected close family connection is real, before investing time in tracing a specific line further back, and occasionally catching cases of misattributed parentage, sometimes called a non-paternity event, that can silently break an assumed genealogical line without anyone realizing it until DNA results surface the discrepancy. None of this means the popular fascination with Mayflower ancestry is misplaced or silly. If anything, understanding how the genealogy actually works makes the search more interesting rather than less, because it reframes the question away from a simple yes or no trivia check and towards something closer to actual historical detective work. Someone whose last name is not on the original 1620 list has not necessarily ruled themselves out. They may simply need to trace back through a maternal line, through a documented marriage, into one of the many families that intermarried with the original passengers within a generation or two of landing, in exactly the way that produced the Delano, Southworth, and Seabury lines discussed earlier. Someone whose last name does appear on the original list, meanwhile, has not automatically proven anything either, since common English surnames of the period were, unsurprisingly, common, and a shared surname alone is not evidence of a shared lineage without the documented generation-by-generation paper trail connecting the two. For anyone seriously interested in finding out whether their own family connects to one of these documented lines, the practical starting point is almost always the same, regardless of which specific surname is involved. Begin with what is actually known and verifiable about your own most recent generations, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, with as much documentation as can be gathered in the form of birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, and obituaries, and work backward one fully documented generation at a time, rather than starting from the Mayflower passenger list and trying to work forward, which is a far less reliable approach given how many unrelated families over the centuries have shared these same common English surnames. organizations like the General Society of Mayflower. Descendants, along with major genealogical archives and record digitization projects that have made colonial-era Massachusetts records far more accessible than they were even 20 years ago, exist specifically to support this kind of careful, generation-by-generation documentation, and a growing number of applicants each year do successfully complete the process and receive formal certified membership. Evidence that for a meaningful number of American families, the old kitchen table story turns out to hold up under real scrutiny. What the surviving 1620-passenger list ultimately offers, more than a simple trivia checklist, is a genuinely rare kind of historical anchor point. A small, fixed, thoroughly documented group of real people whose lives, deaths, marriages, and children were recorded well enough and have been researched thoroughly enough in the 4 centuries since that an ordinary person today can, with patience and the right records, actually trace a real, verifiable line connecting their own family history to a specific individual who survived a 2-month Atlantic crossing in a small wooden ship in a brutal first winter that killed roughly half of everyone who made that same crossing alongside them. Whether or not any particular family's version of the story turns out to hold up, the fact that it can, in principle, be checked at all against real documents, real parish records, and a genuinely closed and unchanging historical list is what makes Mayflower genealogy different from most other forms of family folklore, and part of why so many people continue to find it worth the considerable effort required to actually go looking. Beyond Alden, Bradford, Brewster, Standish, Winslow, Howland, Fuller, Warren, Chilton, and Cook, a number of other 1620 surnames continue to show substantial documented descendant populations today, each with its own distinct story worth a brief mention. Hopkins descends from Stephen Hopkins, a genuinely unusual figure among the passengers, in that he had already survived a prior shipwreck in Bermuda on an earlier voyage years before the Mayflower crossing, an experience some historians believe influenced Shakespeare's The Tempest. Martin traces to Christopher Martin, who served briefly as one of the expedition's governors before his death during the first winter. Mullins belongs to William Mullins, the shoemaker, whose extensive stock of footwear survived him and passed to his daughter Priscilla and her husband John Alden, becoming one of the more concretely documented pieces of material inheritance connected to any Mayflower family. Tilley, English, Rigsdale, Craxton, Fletcher, Goodman, Williams, Margeson, Britteridge. Clark and Gardner all appear among the signers of the Mayflower Compact as well, though several of these lines, like Tilley and Rigsdale, ended in the first winter without surviving direct descendants, appearing in the historical record but not in the modern genealogical one, a distinction that matters enormously to anyone doing serious family history research, since a name's presence on the original passenger list does not by itself guarantee that any documented living lineage from that specific person actually exists today. For anyone tempted to start that search after reading a list like this one, the first is that common surnames are exactly that, common, and finding a Brown, a Turner, a White, or a Rogers somewhere in an old family Bible is nowhere near sufficient on its own to establish any connection to the specific Peter Brown, John Turner, William White, or Thomas Rogers, who sailed on the Mayflower, given how frequently those same surnames appear independently throughout English and later American history entirely unconnected to Plymouth Colony. The second is that the most common failure point in amateur Mayflower research tends to be exactly where the paper trail runs, through a female ancestor whose maiden name was recorded inconsistently, or not recorded at all, across 19th century vital records, which is precisely why professional genealogists so often recommend starting a search with pension records, church membership rolls, and probate documents, which were far more likely to record a woman's maiden name accurately than a simple marriage announcement in a local newspaper. The third is that certified Mayflower Society membership, while a meaningful achievement for the families who pursue it, is not actually required to have a genuinely well-documented family connection to a Mayflower passenger. Plenty of people have assembled a solid, source-backed genealogy, tracing their own line back to Plymouth Colony without ever formally applying for or receiving society certification, simply because the certification process itself is time-consuming, requires notarized documentation at every generational link, and was never designed to be the only valid form of genealogical proof. For families who do decide to pursue the question seriously, state archives in Massachusetts, along with the digitized colonial vital records now available through major genealogical research platforms, have made this kind of research dramatically more accessible than it was even a generation ago, when tracing a 17th century New England lineage often required physically traveling to town halls and historical societies across multiple states to examine original paper records by hand. What has not changed, and likely never will, is the basic discipline the research demands. Start with what you can actually prove about your own recent generations, follow the documented trail backward, one fully verified link at a time, and treat any gap in that chain as a gap to be investigated rather than assumed away. Because it is precisely in those unexamined gaps, more often than not, that the difference between a genuine 400-year-old family story and a comfortable but unverified piece of kitchen table folklore ultimately gets decided.